See, sacrificing your life is something people have to do on their own. Floyd was murdered. We just had a whole trial.
All right, let's now bring in Dr. Robert Gutsche, an associate professor of sociology at Lancaster University. Thanks for coming on the program today. Do you think the guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin will be sufficient to pacify protesters, or will their grievances continue, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you my reaction last night was to take a deep breath after that. And I think there are so many things coming through the reporting that you all just did that shows how this one conviction isn't going to be the linchpin, isn't going to be the silver bullet, which might be an inappropriate thing to say, but it may not be that hypodermic needle to get the change that people want in the United States. And I think there are a lot of individuals, particularly woke white individuals in the U.S. who say, yes, this is it. This is accountability. This is change. We're moving in the right direction. And I think, as your reporting just showed, we're still in a fog and a mess over issues of race. And more importantly, it seems that citizens just aren't willing to do what it takes to get police to fall in line. And by that, I mean either going through court systems beyond just this one situation, holding police more accountable in more cases.
You talk about, holding more police accountable in more cases. Let's just narrow this down for a second. We've seen protesters in New York call for the abolition of the police forces, but also at the same time, we've seen some of these protesters assaulting people at restaurants. So when a call goes to the police, how do you expect them to respond?
Yeah, I think there are lots of things in here. And one of the debates about defunding the police isn't necessarily to, I mean, certainly there may be people calling for the revoke all police from New York City or whatnot. But the notion of defunding the police, which has been really manipulated by politicians in its meaning, is really to, among other things, remove the military grade weaponry that local police forces have access to, which is from the U.S. military. It's surplus from the government. I worked at a university in the States once that had its own tank and had its own, still has its own machine guns. Now, what in the world suggests that a university, for instance, or even a local police force should have access to that type of weaponry? Because what we don't want when we want police to respond is to immediately pull out a gun and maybe mistake a taser for a gun, which has allegedly happened in a previous case recently. I think people want police to respond and to serve the public, certainly, but they don't want them to show up as a member of the military. For instance, when we saw militarized response to protesters in Portland last year, it was hard to distinguish between who were the local police officers and who were federal troops that Donald Trump had put on the streets, partially because those federal troops also went out without any name badges. And so I think people are having a hard time understanding the idea that police forces can serve a purpose, but they shouldn't be a faux militarized militia.
But what about then part of the Black Lives Matter movement in the past year or so after George Floyd? We saw enormous amounts of protesting, demonstrations. CNN liked to call them peaceful protesters when they were torching shops, vandalizing, raiding, thieving as well. What is the end game for the Black Lives Matter protesters, do you think? What do they want at the end of the day? Can we give them what they need?
Well, I mean, I think there's a way to look at notions of looting and rioting and the racialized notions of those terms that people have identified even in most recent scholarship that's out there. In one book called "In the Defense of Looting," which articulates some of these misrepresentations in media. The burning of a CVS or a Target convenience store or a retail store isn't an attack on somebody's own community. It's an attack on hypercapitalism and its effect on the deterioration of their community through gentrification. So that's a whole nother lecture we don't have to do now. But this is a very layered meaning. What do Black Lives Matter individuals want? I'm not quite sure. I think that's also part of the concern concerned. What are the 2 or 3 things? I think one of the things is stop carrying militarized weapons, stop killing black individuals at great numbers. And I think that those are the things that people have asked for, they've gone to the courts for, and they've become violent for.
Well, see, this is one of the things, Dr. Gutsche, I wanted to just jump in here quickly, because this is one of the main themes that we've been seeing now, that of violence. Now, before we got the guilty verdict, what did you make of Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters calling for, quote, confrontation? Some said it amounted to jury intimidation. Would you agree? She was telling people to get serious, to get aggressive, to get physically confrontational with people on the streets. What did you make of the Democratic Congresswoman's comments?
Yeah, I think for a long time, Democrats haven't done themselves a lot of good. And I've also called at some point for some of them to just maybe be locked in a room and do the things that they need to do and maybe not say the words that they're saying. Sometimes they're not very helpful. But I think at the end of the day, there still needs to be a call for people to be out on the streets and for people to take action. And sometimes that does lead to violence. And that's unfortunate for some. But we have to also understand that the Second Amendment, which is in the U.S. Constitution, allows for people to take up arms if they feel the government is tyrannical and is coming for them. And certainly I think that there can be justification at some point for individuals to take up arms against their government if they feel that it is being tyrannical. And I think we see black communities and black individuals and collectives being targeted by U.S. military and by local police forces. I've written about this in my own books, where in Miami they used for target practice mugshots of blacks who had been put into the jail system. And I mean, how do you justify using that for police target practicing? So I think that there are decades of going back to slave patrols, even so centuries of history here that we fail to acknowledge and see coming out on the streets, and instead go to where the cameras go and to where politicians like to insert themselves for probably less than virtuous reasons.
Dr. Gutsche, what about the issue of character? You've got Black Lives Matter, of course, Black lives do matter. You've got White Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, of course. In fact, how about all lives matter? You see, at the end of the day, it should come down to a person's character. A person's character should be more important than the color of their skin. And yet we're seeing a really mixed batch of potentially bad characters out on the streets these days. What is your thought? Do all lives matter, Dr. Gutsche?
Well, I think certainly the notion of all lives matter has been brought up as in the same way that white lives matter, as a way to diminish the movement and to parody the movement of Black Lives Matter. So that's a whole nother conversation we can get into. But absolutely, there is crime happening in particular neighborhoods and among particular collectives that needs to end. But that doesn't excuse the right for police. I mean, living in the United States, you get pulled over by a police officer. It is not unusual for the police officer to immediately unbuckle their gun. Walking into a Starbucks, it's not unusual for a police officer to come in with 3 or 4 firearms attached to their body, and they're walking like a soldier. That's intimidation to an entire citizenry, whether you have dark skin or light skin. That is a behavior of a police state that, quite frankly, is one of the reasons we left that country at that time, because that police state, particularly in Miami, was getting completely out of control. That's the norm. Now imagine being someone who doesn't look like me, who has statistically a greater likelihood to die at a gun or at the knee of a police officer. Having that person walk into Starbucks it could be a very different experience.
All right, Dr. Robert Gutsche, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lancaster University, joining us live here on RT International. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thank you.